For thousands of years, humanity has been haunted by a single question. What if advanced civilization existed before recorded history and was wiped away in a single catastrophic moment? A city of shining temples, advanced knowledge, and unmatched power. A city swallowed whole by the ocean. This is the mythology of Atlantis. The story of Atlantis does not begin with sailors, explorers, or lost maps. It begins with a philosopher. Around 360 BCE, the Atlantean thinker Plato recorded the tales of Atlantis in two of his later dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These works were not myths in the traditional sense, they were philosophical conversations, debates about politics, morality, and the nature of the ideal society. And within them, Plato introduces Atlantis not as a legend he invented, but as a historical account passed down through generations. Plato tells us the story came from Atlantean lawmaker Solon, one of the seven sages of Greece. During his travels, Solon journeyed to Egypt, then considered the cradle of ancient wisdom. There in the city of Sais, he met priests who claimed their civilization preserved records far older than anything known in Greece. When Solomon spoke proudly of Greek history, the priests reportedly laughed. They told him the Greeks were like children, forgetful, rebuilding civilization again and again after great catastrophes erased the past. And then they shared a story preserved on ancient temple walls. A story of a powerful island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. A date that would place Atlantis deep in the prehistoric past, long before classical civilization as we know it. According to the priests, Atlantis was once a mighty naval power that ruled vast territories and challenged even ancient Athens itself. Its people were technologically advanced, politically organized, and wealthy beyond measures. But the priests also warned that Atlantis fell, not gradually, not through decline, but through sudden destruction. Plato insists this account was meant to be taken seriously. In Timaeus, he explicitly states that Atlantis was a true story, not an invented fable. He emphasizes this point repeatedly, as if anticipating skepticism from his audience. Plato never mentions Atlantis anywhere else in his extensive body of work. No other Greek writer before him references it, and after Critias ends mid-sentence, no less, the story stops entirely. The dialogue breaks off as if the final account was lost or never finished. This abrupt ending has fueled centuries of debate. Was Plato faithfully recording an ancient tradition passed down from the Egypt? Was Atlantis a symbolic narrative, a cautionary tale about power, arrogance, and moral decay? Or was it a fusion of history and philosophy inspired by real disasters but reshaped to serve a deeper message? Instead, he leaves us with a mystery, one suspended between history and myth, fact and alleged. And it is in that uncertainty that Atlantis is born. According to ancient accounts, Atlantis was not founded by mortals alone. It was shaped by a god. The Greeks believed the island was claimed by Poseidon, ruler of the oceans, storms, and earthquakes. When Poseidon first discovered the land, it was wild and untamed, an untouched island rising from the vast western sea. There, Poseidon encountered a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her from the outside world, Poseidon did something extraordinary. He reshaped the island itself. With the divine power, he carved 3 circular rings of water and 2 rings of island around a central hill, creating a city unlike anything humanity has ever seen. These concentric circles formed a natural fortress, part harbor, part palace, part sacred geometry. At the very center stood the heart of Atlantis, a sacred acropolis crowned by a magnificent temple dedicated to Poseidon himself. The temple was vast beyond imagination. Its walls were lined with silver, its pinnacles capped in gold, and its inner sanctum glowed with orchium, a legendary metal said to shine like fire and rival gold in value. Here stood a towering statue of Poseidon, driving 6 winged horses across the sea, so large it nearly touched the ceiling. Atlantis was not merely beautiful, it was engineered. The Atlanteans were master builders and planners. Canals cut cleanly through land, allowing ships to sail directly from the sea into the city's heart. Bridges spanned the rings, guarded by gates and towers. Freshwater springs, one hot, one cold, flowed naturally from the ground, providing baths, irrigation, and even drinking water year-round. The city's layout reflected cosmic order, a balance between land and sea, mortal and divine. Beyond the central city lay fertile plains stretching hundreds of miles, meticulously divided into agricultural zones. These fields produced abundant crops, feeding a population that never knew hunger. Atlantis was said to possess forests, mountains rich in mineral and exotic animals. Some scholars even speculate Plato hinted at elephants roaming the island. Everything the Atlanteans needed, the land provided, and everything they built reflected their belief that they were favored by the gods. Poseidon had 10 sons with Cleito, 5 pairs of twins who became the first kings of Atlantis. The eldest, Atlas, ruled as High King, giving his name not only to the island, but according to later myth, to the Atlantic Ocean itself. Each son governed a region of the empire, bound by sacred laws engraved on pillars of ortrium within Poseidon's temple. These laws demanded restraint, cooperation, and loyalty among the kings, reminding them that their authority came not from conquest, but from divine trust. At first, the rulers of Atlantis honored these laws. They governed with wisdom, they avoided internal conflict, they valued balance over domination. As long as the divine nature within them outweighed their moral impulses, Atlantis thrived. Plato described Atlantis as a civilization overflowing with riches. Gold and silver were plentiful, harbors were packed with ships from across the known world, markets buzzed with trade, art, and inventions. The Atlanteans possessed advanced architecture and maritime engineering. Their navy was unmatched, their walls impenetrable, their city illuminated by wealth drawn from land and sea alike. To outsiders, Atlantis appeared invisible. To its people, it felt internal. And yet, Plato subtly warned that beneath this perfection lay a fragile truth. The same divine favor that raised Atlantis could just as easily be withdrawn. The city of gods and kings stood at the height of its power, unaware that its great strength would soon become its greatest flaw. But Plato tells us that decay does not always arrive through chaos, sometimes it arrives through comfort. The kings of Atlantis were born of both God and moral. In the early generations, their divine nature dominated their character. They ruled with restraint, honoring Poseidon's laws, and remembering that power was a responsibility, not a right. Over time, however, the balance shifted. With each new generation, the divine blood thinned out. The mortal nature of the Atlanteans grew stronger, bringing with it ambition, desire, and pride. They no longer saw themselves as stewards of a divine gift, they saw themselves as masters of the world. Atlantis had everything. Its armies were vast, its navies ruled the sea, its wealth seemed limitless, and so the Atlanteans began to believe a dangerous idea. They thought they were untouchable. What had once been unity became entitlement. What had once been prosperity became excess. Gold, once sacred, became common. Luxury ceased to inspire gratitude and instead fueled greed. Plato described a people who slowly abandoned moderation. They built higher walls not for protection but to display dominance. They expanded their fleet not for trade but for conquest. They measured success not by harmony but by control. Atlantis did not fall into corruption overnight. It convinced itself that corruption was progress. The Atlanteans turned outward. They extended their influence across distant lands, subjugating people far from their island home, regions of North Africa, parts of Southern Europe, and territories across the Mediterranean fell under Atlantean control. What began as an alliance between domination, other civilizations were no longer equals. They were resources. Plato contrasts Atlantis with ancient Athens, portraying the Atlanteans as a technological superior empire that lacked moral discipline, while Athens represents restraint, balance, and virtue. In this contrast lies the heart of the myth. Atlantis had strength without wisdom, power without humility, knowledge without restraint. And this imbalance, Plato suggests, was unforgivable. In Greek mythology, hubris, the belief that morals could rival the gods, was the greatest sin of all, and Atlantis committed it fully. The Atlanteans believed their success proved divine favor would never fade. They assumed the gods were permanent allies, silent witnesses to their rise, unwilling to interfere. But the gods were watching, and they were not pleased. Plato tells us that when the corruption of Atlantis became complete, when the divine element within its people fully overwhelmed by mortal greed, the gods intervened. At the head of this judgment stood Zeus. Zeus, guardian of a cosmic order, convened the gods to decide the fate of Atlantis. This moment is crucial. Atlantis is not destroyed because it is weak, it is destroyed because it had become unjust. The myth makes clear power alone does not save a civilization, only virtue does. Plato describes Atlantis as having crossed a threshold. There was no reform, no awakening, no last-minute redemption. The kings ignored the ancient laws carved into Poseidon's temple. The people embraced excess. The empire expanded without conscience. And so the gods withdrew their favor. In that withdrawal, Atlantis was already lost. Long before the earth shook, long before the sea rose, long before the city vanished beneath the waves. The destruction that followed was not sudden punishment. It was the final consequence of a civilization that mistook dominance for greatness. Plato crafted Atlantis as a mirror, reflecting what happens when society prioritizes power over ethics, expansion over balance, and wealth over wisdom. Atlantis fell not because it lacked strength, but because it forgot why strength must be restrained. And in that forgetting, the greatest city on earth sealed its own fate. The end of Atlantis did not come slowly. There was no years of warning, no gradual collapse, no chance to escape. According to Plato, the destruction unfolded in a single day and a single night, a span of time so brief it feels almost unreal, as if history itself blinked and an entire world vanished. When the corruption of Atlantis reached its peak, the gods withdrew their protection, and with that withdrawal, the natural order turned against the city. At the center of the divine response stood Zeus, guardian of balance and cosmic law. Plato tells us that Zeus conveyed the gods to decide Atlantis' fate through the dialogue break-offs before revealing the exact words spoken. The silence is intentional, the punishment needs no explanation. In Greek mythology, justice is not debated with when hubris is absolute. The gods did not argue, they did not warn, they acted. And the instruments of that judgment were the forces Atlantis believed it had mastered. The first sign were beneath the ground. The earth convulsed. Massive earthquakes tore through the island, shattering the carefully planned symmetry of the city. Bridges collapsed into the canals, towers cracked and fell. The concentric rings, once symbols of divine order, became traps of stone and water. Temples split open, streets buckled, the great wall, meant to display power, crumbled into rubble. The Atlanteans, who had conquered land and ruled seas, found themselves helpless against the very foundation of their world turning against them. As the land broke apart, the waters surged, tsunamis vast and unstoppable, rushing through the harbors and canals, overwhelming the city from every direction. Rings of water that once protected Atlantis now accelerated its destruction, funneling the ocean directly into its heart. Ships were ripped from their mooring and smashed against stone. Entire districts vanished beneath waves, thick with debris, fire, and bodies. In some retellings, this final blow carries the mark of Poseidon himself, the same god who had raised Atlantis from the sea, now reclaiming it. The ocean did not hesitate, it swallowed the city whole. By dawn, Atlantis was gone. Not ruined, not abandoned, not conquered, gone. Where places once stood, there was only churning water. Where temples once gleamed with gold and ortrium, there was silence. The island itself sank beneath the waves, leaving behind a sea rendered impassable and impenetrable. No survivors returned to tell the tale, no monuments remained above the surface, no warnings were carved into stone. Atlantis vanished so completely that later generations would question whether it had even existed at all. Plato is careful to frame the destruction as more than a natural disaster. This was not random chaos, it was consequences. Atlantis fell not because it lacked knowledge, but because it lacked wisdom. Not because it challenged the gods, but because it forgot the limits placed on mortals. In Greek thought, nature itself enforces moral order. When balance is violated, the world responds. The earthquakes and floods were not merely punishment, they were restitution. After the destruction, nothing of Atlantis remained visible, only rumors, memory, and silence. And yet, its disappearance made it immortal. Because a city that vanishes in a single night leaves behind more questions than answers. Was Atlantis a warning to ancient Greece? A mythology memory of a real catastrophe? Or a timeless reminder that power without restraint always ends the same way? Atlantis sank beneath the waves, but its lessons rose with every generation that followed. After the sea closed over Atlantis, silence followed, and to that silence stepped a question that had echoed more than 2,000 years. Did Atlantis truly exist? The answer depends on how one reads Plato and how one understands the purpose of myth itself. Plato is unusually insistent when he introduces Atlantis. In Timaeus, he states outright that the story is not a fiction, but it's a true account. He emphasizes that it came from Egyptian records preserved through generations and transmitted into Greece by Solon, a man of Plato's audience respected as a lawgiver and statesman. Plato often used myths as teaching tools, but when he did, he usually labeled them as such or framed them symbolically. With Atlantis, however, he goes out of his way to ground the story in lineage, geographic, and chronological. For some scholars, this signals that Plato believes Atlantis was based on real events, even if the details were shaped by time and retelling. For others, the insistence itself feels theatrical, as though Plato was deliberately blurring the lines between history and philosophy. One of the most endearing interpretations is that Atlantis was never meant to be found. In this view, Atlantis functions as a philosophical mirror, a fictional empire constructed to demonstrate the dangers of arrogance, imperialism, and moral decay. From this perspective, Atlantis is a warning. A civilization that prioritizes power over justice will destroy itself no matter how advanced it becomes. Whether Atlantis existed physically is irrelevant. Its message is the reality. Yet the debates do not end there. Some researchers believe Atlantis was inspired by genuine historical disasters, memories transformed into myths over centuries. One of the most common theories links Atlantis to the Minoan civilization. The volcanic eruption of Thera triggered massive earthquakes and tsunamis, devastating Minoan cities and permanently altering the region. To ancient observers, such an event could easily have felt like a world-ending catastrophe. A powerful island culture, a sudden destruction by sea and earth, a civilization remembered but never fully recovered. The similarities are difficult to ignore. Others push the idea even further. They suggest Atlantis was far older than any other known Bronze Age culture, a lost global civilization erased by cataclysm at the end of the last ice age. Rising sea levels, massive floods, and climate shifts between 12,000 and 9,000 BCE did dramatically reshape coastlines worldwide. Entire settlements would have been submerged, leaving little trace behind. In this view, Atlantis represents humanity's forgotten deep past, a civilization whose knowledge vanished, leaving only fragments encoded in myth. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical of this theory, citing a lack of physical evidence, but the idea persists. Perhaps because it challenges the comforting notion that progress is permanent. What makes Atlantis unique is not just its mystery, but its ambiguity. Plato never gives us a map we could trust. He never provides ruins we can excavate, and he ends the story before its final details are revealed. Atlantis exists in a space between certainty and imagination. That may be intentional, because a city that can be proven ceases to be a myth. The myth that cannot be dismissed becomes immortal. Atlantis survives because it refuses to settle into one category. It is history that feels like legend, legend that feels like warning, and warning that feels uncomfortably familiar. In the end, the question was Atlantis real? Maybe the wrong question. The better question might be, why do we need it to be? Atlantis embodies humanity's fear that knowledge can outpace wisdom, that power can erase itself, that even the greatest civilization can vanish without warning, whether it lies beneath the ocean or only within the human mind. Atlantis continues to exist, and perhaps this was Plato's intention all along. Although Atlantis vanished beneath the waves, it never disappeared from the human imagination. Instead, it evolved. Freed from the constraints of ancient texts, Atlantis became something larger than Plato's original account, a symbol reshaped by each era to reflect its own hopes, fears, and obsessions. For centuries after Plato, Atlantis remained largely a philosophical reference, a cautionary tale discussed by scholars rather than dreamers. Medieval writers rarely mention it, focusing instead on biblical floods and divine judgment. But as Europe entered the age of exploration, something changed. New continents were discovered, ancient maps were redrawn, the world suddenly felt vast and unknown again. In this atmosphere, Atlantis reemerged not as an allegory but as a possibility. Some believe it laid in the Atlantic Ocean, others place it in the Caribbean, Antarctica, or beneath the sands of North Africa. The myth adapted to the expanding world, becoming a blank space where imagination could roam freely. In the 19th century, Atlantis took on a new role as supposed proof of a lost advanced civilization. Writers like Denali argue that Atlantis was the mother culture of all ancient civilization, responsible for pyramids, writing, and engineering across the globe. His book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, popularized the idea that human history was far older and far more advanced than scholars admitted. Though modern archaeology rejects these claims, Denali's ideas left a permanent mark. Atlantis became linked to ancient technology, lost knowledge, and suppressed history, themes that still dominate conspiracy theories today. As the 20th century dawned, Atlantis migrated into fiction. It appeared in pulp novels, comic books, and early science fiction, often portrayed as a technological superior civilization powered by crystals, energy beams, or forgotten science. Occult movements embraced Atlantis as well, which claim Atlanteans possess psychic abilities and spiritual knowledge far beyond modern humanity. In these retellings, Atlantis was no longer just a cautionary tale, it was a lost golden age, a time when humanity lived in harmony with forces now forgotten or even forbidden. Modern film, television, and video games have ensured Atlantis remains culturally alive. From animated adventures to epic blockbusters, Atlantis is depicted as a glowing underwater kingdom, a ruined city waiting to be rediscovered, or a warning buried beneath the sea. Whether portrayed as benevolent or dangerous, Atlantis often represents humanity's complicated relationship with progress, our belief that technology can save us, paired with the fear that it will destroy us. In the video games and speculative fiction, Atlantis becomes interactive, allowing players and audience to explore what was lost and sometimes what should remain lost. Atlantis endures because it evolves alongside us. In times of optimism, Atlantis is imagined as a utopia, proof that humanity once achieved greatness. In the times of anxiety, it becomes a warning, a civilization undone by arrogance, excess, and imbalance. Today, in an age of rapid technology growth and environmental uncertainty, Atlantis feels more relevant than ever. A city consumed by rising seas, a society undone by unchecked power, a world convinced of its own permanence, that parallels are impossible to ignore. Atlantis survives because it is unfinished. Plato never gave us closure, history never gave us proof, and culture never stopped asking questions. Atlantis exists wherever humanity wonders about its past and worries about its future. And as long as we continue to search for meaning beneath the surface, Atlantis will continue to rise. If Atlantis existed, it reminded us of what humanity once was or could be. If it never existed, it still tells us something essential. That progress without wisdom leads to ruin, and that no civilization, no matter how powerful, is immune to collapse. Atlantis may be lost, but its lessons remain.